Hey guys, welcome back to week 5. This week we're going to look at some of the debates that Alexander Campbell had and Walter Scott. Now Walter Scott's kind of one of the four big figures along with Alexander Thomas Campbell and Barton Stone. He's kind of the fourth, the evangelist of the group, the one who brings the most converts and has the most success preaching. So we're going to look at him, but first we're going to take a look at these debates by Alexander Campbell. Okay, these are the debates that are public, are the most common ones. You'll typically hear about the big five, and that's kind of these minus the Skinner, because the Skinner debate was actually just a written debate that went back and forth. But these others are public debates. These are the big ones. The most important by far is the Rice debate that he has. And so this is actually one of the debates I have as a PDF up on Canvas. You don't have to read these debates, but if you want to look at them, they're available. Now the Rice debate is massive. Just for perspective here, I'll kind of hold this up for you. This is the 1,000-page Rice debate published in the 1840s. The debate was 1843, and it's very small print, very long, very. I won't say it's boring because I don't think it's boring, but don't spend too much time on it unless you really want to get into the details. So these are the ones we're going to look at, and we're not just trying to, I don't want you to necessarily just memorize these names. I mean, it's good if you know them, but I really don't care if you know who we debated. What the goal is in this lecture is to kind of see why Campbell said what he said, and more clearly, I think, even than in the written records at times, public debates, because you're allowed to press into what people are really saying, they provide a window into the understanding of movements in general. One thing to keep in mind, public debates in the early 1800s, particularly on religious debates, it wasn't just so one side could argue with the other. And frequently, it was given so that people could come and hear what one side taught. And if you have a lot of people who maybe can't read very well, certainly can't read at the level that some of these people were writing on, and you wanted to hear them speak for a few days even on what their views were on key doctrines of the church, and that's sweeping across the nation, and there's this large sense that God's moving, and you want to find out what God's doing, you would go to these things to hear from them. You think just a few years later, when President Abraham Lincoln, or not yet President Abraham Lincoln, became famous through debates with people. And it was people would go and they would listen to him or any of the great debaters of this time, and they would not just be there to hear them argue, but they wanted to hear what they had to say. So a lot of people this time were coming and hearing from the Campbell, or specifically Alexander Campbell, what people had to say. And most of the debates we're looking at, all of the debates we're looking at today are from Alexander Campbell. Later on, people like Moses Lard, who I'll introduce later, he's got the best neck beard of all people. And you'll see what I mean when I show him. But other people are having debates later on. But the most influential ones are just clearly from Alexander. So that's the ones we're looking at now. Okay, looking at the first debate, this is one of the debates that I do have on Canvas as well. So PDF of this whole debate is on Canvas, and this is actually the easier one to read because someone took the time to type it out instead of just photocopy the book from 1822. The debate was 1820. They published it 2 years later. At any rate, your book's a little misleading, I think, actually, on why Campbell didn't originally agree. He did talk about kind of his distrust of debates and the lack of good from them. And when we see in Rice, and I'll explain here in a little bit, he kind of disliked debates for the same reason that he liked councils, because he didn't see coming together and kind of arguing that as a sufficient way and a beneficial way of doing it at first. And he kind of kept that attitude in some regard through the whole ministry. But so he gets this letter from a guy who's debating Baptists and denies it. And then if you read in the Millennial Harbinger, the way that Campbell describes why he eventually did, and this is why I think the book is just slightly off on this, the way the Millennial Harbinger describes it Campbell's own writing, is that he was persuaded over and over again to finally go and debate him. And as a result, and I think this shocked many of the Presbyterians, they did not expect Alexander Campbell to be so proficient in the scriptures or in history. And it's not just the scriptures that Alexander Campbell argues from. As we'll see later on, Alexander Campbell made tremendous use of the church fathers in these debates. I mean, quoting Chrysostom, Origen, Cyprian, Augustine, many other church fathers, just prolifically, especially whenever they're kind of useful to his argument, but he points out stuff just to show what he's saying is not unique to him. And I greatly appreciate that, because even though he's not using what many of those authors wrote about as creeds, he's using them to say that, what I'm saying about the scriptures and what I'm saying about baptism in particular is not new to me. Okay. So the debates, and most of his debates, at least with the Presbyterians, they centered on the idea of baptism. So Walker, you've read, or you will read the 13 lines that Walker opens with. Essentially, Walker connects, because of what Colossians 2 verse 12 says, or 11 and 12 says, about baptism and being the circumcision not done with human hands. And he makes that connection with circumcision in the Old Covenant, that infants were baptized or circumcised. And this is the connection he's trying to make, circumcised on the 8th day. And so baptism can also be done of infants, and so he's trying to make that connection. And Campbell, of course, has a lot to say against that, specifically about the way the New Testament is used, because there are no instances of infant baptism in the New Testament. And so he went through the scriptures, and he shows, passages that we'll spend a lot of time looking at next week. He shows Galatians 3, he shows 1 Peter, he shows Colossians 2. All of these connect not only baptism with salvation, but they connect baptism that's done through faith. Okay, so it's not just the debate on circumcision that's going on here. And the Presbyterian, he wasn't prepared for what all of Alexander Campbell had to say, and it was very obvious. And so this one I'm not going to spend a ton of time on, just because it wasn't quite fair. I'll just put it that way. The guy was not ready for what Alexander Campbell was going to say, and someone could be more ready if they had sufficient ideas of what their opponent was going to say. But the thing that does happen from this that I do want you to see is that after this, and the subsequent publication of this debate in 1822, this is what kind of leads Alexander Campbell to start publishing the Christian Baptist in 1823. In other words, he has begun to see the power of the pen. So, the 1,000 copies that they printed of this in 1822 were immediately sold out. And the following year, when they made an additional 3,000 copies, those were immediately sold out. And so, you've got thousands of people reading this. In fact, one of the individuals who read his work, Sidney Rigdon, who for a while was impactful on the Christian church, and he went to the house of Alexander Campbell following this debate after reading it, and he wanted to learn more. And eventually Sidney Rigdon would leave the Restoration movement and actually become an apostle in the Mormon church. And that's why to this day the Mormons practice baptism for the remission of sins, because Sidney Rigdon was taught about baptism from Campbell and then left him. And Campbell actually writes against, in 1832, he writes against the Mormons, but that's for another time. Okay, the second debate, again, it's kind of vastly underestimating what Alexander Campbell is able to produce and bring forward. And when you're dealing with someone who studied alone for 10 hours, a lot of it standing up, who read the fathers in Latin and Greek. And you can't just approach someone like that and say, well, I know this verse that seems to go against what you have to say. No, I mean, it's someone who really read the scriptures, and that's where I think in these first two debates especially, it's not so much true after this, but in these first two debates, they kind of just threw someone at Alexander Campbell, but it wasn't quite prepared for what Alexander Campbell was capable of. So I did focus chiefly on baptism again, and I don't need to repeat all of that. And I say he's not prepared. I mean, he writes a transcript, and he reads from it. He doesn't address anything. I mean, he's open about this. He doesn't address anything that Campbell says. He just reads his transcript, and that's his side of the debate. So, and from this, the most important thing from this wasn't the debate itself. This is the first time Alexander Campbell goes to Kentucky, and he distributes, you know, it's 1823, so the first year of the Christian Baptist being published. He distributes some of those documents, and, you know, within a year he's 1,000 people, potentially even 1,000 Kentuckian Presbyterians subscribe to the Christian Baptist. So, this is the power of the pen in full force. Kentucky is won over in part and largely, and thousands of people become Christians and come to the church as a result of some of these publications and the influence that those would have on the Christians in Kentucky. So, massive event. That's the most significant thing, is the influence on Kentucky from this. But, you know, so Alexander Campbell's, he's got the document called the Christian Baptist. Okay, he's, you know, the Bush Run Church at this point was a part of the Redstone Baptist, and eventually he's going to have to switch over to a different Baptist association. But the Baptists are becoming increasingly hesitant of, or suspect of, Campbell's teaching, because Campbell was teaching that baptism was for the remission of sins. And these debates kind of made that very public. And once you have it in writing, you know, people can just look into it for themselves and see what Campbell was teaching. Okay, one thing that gets brought up here in these debates, and I'm not going to spend a terribly amount of time on this, but I know it's important, and so I feel it necessary to highlight, is the origin of infant baptism. One of the things that has been brought up in both of these debates, and if you go and read them, they'll bring up these 4 passages in Scripture. These are the passages that talk about, you know, the oikos, the family was baptized that very hour. So, you know, Cornelius's family, Philip and the jailer, and so forth. And what you have in all of these passages, and what Campbell points out, is that in all of these cases, the text shows that the whole family had faith. And so while the Presbyterians in these debates were arguing that, well, since the time of the New Testament, people have been practicing infant baptism. But Campbell points out that, you know, actually, if those oikos could not have infants, because all of the passages say that those entire families put their trust in the Lord. And so that was kind of his turn on that. There are no instances in the New Testament, certainly no clear instances, of any infant being baptized. The first instance that it's actually referenced, and this is quite interesting, the first clear reference to infant baptism is in Tertullian. So he's writing, he's the Latin father who's writing in the year 200, and he says of baptism, you know, evidently it was taking place because he says, well, why not wait until they can decide for themselves? So actually the first reference of infant baptism in the history of the church, from what we know, is from somebody who's suggesting against it. Now, post-Augustine, particularly on Augustine's work on baptism in infants and original sin in infants, in the West it becomes, it's unquestionable. And it's no question that in the Middle Ages, many infants were baptized. That was the norm. for the late Middle Ages especially. You still had converts and so forth. In the East and the West disagreed on the mode of baptism, and I'll talk about that next week some. In the East, they'll still immerse infants. I mean, they'll do triple immersion. In fact, just to pique your interest a little bit, one of the things that St. Basil would say in his work on the Holy Spirit is that one of the apostolic traditions passed on to the church is triple immersion. In the name of the Father, 1 immersion, 2, the Son, 3, in the name of the Holy Spirit. And so in the East, they would do triple immersion. In the West, they later on, much later than this, would begin sprinkling and pouring. But the norm was certainly immersion. But so in the Middle Ages, back to this point specifically, it becomes the norm to do it in the Middle Ages until the Reformation, when some people start questioning that again pretty vocally. Everett Ferguson, though, he wrote this book, and it's as big and daunting as it looks. I mean, it's in terms of just pure contents, it's 800 pages. And by the way, Everett Ferguson, he's publishing this through Eerdmans, and it is widely recognized as the best book on the subject ever written. But he's actually a preacher, minister at a restoration college. So he actually comes from the Stone Campbell movement, the guy who looked into this history. And I want to point out a few things that he says about this, because in 800 pages, how am I going to summarize that? But he has a few things that I think are worth showing. First of all, that infant baptism was not seen in connection with circumcision in the early church. So this point that the Presbyterians are bringing up in these debates, that Colossians chapter 2 shows that we're baptized with a circumcision not done by human hands. Okay, but Everett Ferguson, I think, clearly shows that in the earliest centuries of the church, there was a certain parallel between baptism and circumcision, but none of the early church fathers took that none of them took that as a means for baptizing infants. That's a fairly later argument. And so the way the Presbyterians would argue that now is not the same way that anyone in the early church would articulate it. Okay, now, second point, I have a quote from Ferguson to kind of show you. This is his summary. I'll let him summarize himself. When we recall the high infant mortality rate of the ancient world, it is easy to understand how an emergency practice, speaking about infant baptism, eventually became a normal practice. The fact is that we cannot give the name of anyone before the 4th century, not in an emergency situation, who was baptized as an infant. Okay? So, if it was practiced so openly, then you have no one, you can name no one. And it seems to be, this is what he argues, and this is almost 400 pages into the book, and at this point he's traced the history of infant baptism extremely extensively. His point is less about the mode of baptism and more about, hey, there was a practice amongst families. You're talking about a time in history when 50% of humans died before the age of 18. Okay? Many of them were born, and because they don't have the same sort of health care that we have now in the West, or in the East for that matter, you're going to have a more high chance of dying. And so there arose a practice, and there's several inscriptions of this in the history of the church. There arose a practice of actually baptizing the infant because they understood that baptism was for the remission of sins, and placed such a high view on passages like John 3:5 that they began to do it as an emergency circumstance. And so you have inscriptions of that. And his opinion, and I would tend to agree mostly with him, I think, that the history suggests that it arose as a result of this emergency action that became normal. When you have so many people dying as infants and you want to make sure that they're baptized, that became the normal practice. Okay, so I can't summarize everything, but that's what the greatest scholar on this topic has to say, and I don't have good reasons from history to disagree with him. So that seems to be why it arose. All right, kind of moving on. Campbell takes a little break from debating Presbyterians, and he debates Owen. And I've got a couple debates here to show, but Owen was kind of a socialist, kind of this idea of creating a utopia in the New World, internationally recognized, not only in America but elsewhere, as a good secularist, as someone who, although he would deny being an atheist, I mean, functionally he was, and he believed that every religion was, I mean, one of his 12 points that he makes is that all of the religions of the world are damaging to society. And so once you create a society, this is a summary of his position, once you create a society free from all of the harms of religion, the natural result is that you're free from problems. Okay, so that's what he tried to create. Failed, ran out of money, but he still was popular after that. And so the debate that he has with Campbell, really the first time that Campbell has a public debate with anyone outside of the Christian kind of tradition, especially the Presbyterians, and so many people came to listen to him. And kind of similar to the previous debate, this was kind of common in debates in this era, is, you know, he wouldn't, Campbell had points to flesh out, and he had some questions for Owen, and Owen was more interested in getting his 12 points across. He makes it very clear that he's going to articulate the 12 points, and if you read the very end, it's very fascinating. If you read the very end of Owen's time, he's done presenting his 12 points, and so he sits down and he suggests, okay, I have nothing else further to say in this situation. I'm going to let Alexander Campbell make a closing remark. And Campbell gets up, and over a period of two days, you know, he speaks for as long as 12 hours. So the closing remark by Campbell in this debate was 12 hours of uninterrupted time. Meaning, uninterrupted doesn't mean they didn't take breaks. It means that Owen didn't get up and speak to anything that Campbell was saying. And so what it actually functioned as, and in this printed form of the debate, you know, 200 pages of this, is just that single bit from Campbell. So over half the debate is just Campbell talking about secularism and religion in general. So he took on a larger role. And after 1829, Alexander Campbell, in this debate with him, gets some fame across America and you know, in Europe for kind of refuting much of what Owen had to say. So his popularity goes up greatly from this. All right, the Purcell debate. This is the debate with the great Catholic. Now, Purcell, just to put this in perspective, you're the Bishop of Cincinnati in an era when there's rapid Catholic immigration, but prior to America's founding, there's just very little Catholics. So Purcell, as a bishop of Cincinnati, one of the largest cities in America at this point, is the most influential Catholic in America. Okay? It'd be like someone debating Bishop Barron or one of the other great Catholics in America. Now, the debate, they're close friends. If you go and you read the 7 points, and this is one of the documents, it's really easy to kind of read through this, because even though they're debating kind of heavy topics, Campbell calls the Roman Catholic Church, the horn from Daniel, or the harlot of Babylon, and has some strong stuff to say about the Roman Catholic Church. Keep in mind, this is prior to the Vatican Councils. So the Catholic Church's official position at this point was all Protestants are unsaved. I mean, that was their official teaching until the Vatican Councils, which allowed for the possibility of people outside of the Catholic Church to still be followers of Christ. So it's not just one side saying, hey, we're the Christians and you're not. It's the Catholics at that time were openly saying that. But they were friends. I mean, they ate at each other's house, and they kept writing back and forth after this debate. Just to jump ahead for a moment, Campbell, after this, he even writes a publication for Purcell's journal, kind of advocating for Americans to not be so anti-Catholic. And so that's why I say this, that Campbell seems to have been the most persuaded. It's not that he became a Catholic or anything like that, but as I've mentioned before, and I think this debate more than anything fleshes this out, the Campbell that you read about in the Christian Baptist, 1820-1830, is different than the one in the Millennial Harbinger. Campbell increasingly saw Christians in denominations that no one else was claiming to be Christian, like the Catholics. And so he would call them, at one point, a sect of Christianity, which is a massive statement. When Campbell died, Purcell, and this is a remarkable thing for a Catholic bishop. I'm not sure if he was a Catholic bishop when Campbell died in the 60s, but he might have been. But it's remarkable for a Catholic bishop to say of Campbell, he said that if Campbell was born in the early church, he would have been sainted in the Catholic Church. That he would have been, this is in his words, on the same token as John Chrysostom or Athanasius or any of the other great fathers. And so it seems to me that Purcell actually accepted Alexander Campbell as a Christian at the end of his life. And as rough as this debate was, and there are some things that are said in there that shock me, truthfully, but as rough as this is, it's actually kind of a beautiful story in how it ends. That a Catholic, at the hearing of Alexander Campbell's death, would be so thankful for Alexander Campbell's life. So, make that what you will. The two grew closer. And Purcell, to his credit too, he actually warns Campbell not to debate a guy that Campbell will debate soon after, Rice. Because Rice was sarcastic and kind of talked openly about, in his arguments, he kind of did ad hominems and attacks against the people he was debating that weren't really polite. And so a Catholic bishop warns Alexander Campbell to not debate Rice, just because of the conduct of Rice in the debate. So with that being said, let's get to the Rice debate. This is the most telling document, in my opinion, the most telling document of nearly all of the positions of Alexander Campbell regarding creeds, the Spirit, the Scriptures, and the Restoration movement in general, particularly of union and unity. So, it's remarkably hard to find a copy of it now, but I do have that PDF for you. Rice was, just to say it plainly, he was a bit grumpy in the debate. There's a lot of actual discussion after this is published and it's sent out. The Presbyterians want to send it out because to them, Rice won. And of course, both sides decided who won before the debate happened. You know how that can go. But when it's sent out, they actually, it seems like they cut out a lot of what Rice said, particularly the sarcastic comments, because they didn't want that to be in print. and both, it's not just a stenograph of what was said. Both parties in all the publications of these debates, they're very open about the fact that they kind of summarize some of the arguments, and they don't record everything word for word. It wasn't like they had a recorder. It was mostly people trying to write in shorthand or going back and kind of summarizing the feeling of the argument that was being made. And so it's kind of hard to know what was actually said in most of these debates. And all history is biased, but you'd really like to have the words in this case. But in this debate, at this point in Kentucky, now remember the debate that happened previous, the first time Campbell went down there and debated. At this point in Kentucky, this is after Stone and Campbell had joined, that movement outnumbered the Presbyterians 5-1. So at this point in history, the Restoration movement was the fastest growing religious body in all of America. And Kentucky's kind of a testimony to that fact. And if you go to Lexington, Kentucky now, where this debate took place, you'll find some of the biggest Christian churches with the longest history because of stuff like this. So it is the most telling of Campbell's beliefs in general. I've already mentioned that. Now this is what's interesting, and this is what's different and unique about the debate, and something I want to focus in on for a moment. They both argued for the need for Christian unity, but they disagreed on the mode or method about bringing that unity. Okay, at one point in the debate, this is towards the end, Rice gets up and he says, "Friends, we both want unity, but we disagree on how to accomplish that unity." This is a discussion on creeds. And a lot of the discussion from this Presbyterian minister at this point is on the benefits versus the dangers of creeds. And this gets into something quite specific that I think is so helpful in really understanding what the Restoration movement, at least in the beginning, their position of creeds was. Because as I've mentioned before, and I'm about to show some evidence of this, Campbell was not against creeds. Okay, in the same way that John Johnson of the Springfield Presbytery, he said, however useful creeds are, even if they're perfect, we won't use them as tests of fellowship. Campbell begins to go into, particularly in the issue of Nicaea and Arius, and they circulate on this argument for quite some time. It's very considerable. And I'll show you in the document that I have on Canvas. You can go and read this if you'd like. But Arius, of course, denied that the Son was of the same essence of the Father. Okay? And it's always the preachers like Arius who bring about the greatest heresies. That's just historically true. But Arius taught that, and of course the debate was he of the same nature, like nature, different nature, or similar nature, and there's all sorts of discussions, especially in the 4th century, about that. But the councils didn't really solve the issue. Now let me just give you a glimpse at this. This isn't an early centuries class, so I'll just give you an overview about particularly important to our point. In 325, when Nicaea is kind of codified and it's established, and Arius is condemned in some sense, anathematized, immediately following that, there were dozens of smaller councils, some big councils, that said, actually, Nicaea was wrong. It's Arianism. That's the way that we should go. To such an extent that Jerome, later on, he would say that one of the laments of Athanasius of Alexandria was that the whole world had turned Arian, that even Roman emperors in the 4th century were Arian. And so you had great defenders of Nicaea, like Athanasius of Alexandria, being exiled from Alexandria, from the Roman Empire, on 5 separate occasions during his life. Why is that the case? This is after Nicaea, and he's trying to argue for a Nicene faith. Well, just because it was in the creed didn't mean that everyone started accepting it. And in fact, this is what Campbell would say. I think this is a fairly good point in some respect. I'm just arguing from Campbell's perspective right now. Campbell would say, did putting Arianism in writing and having that council, did it stop Arianism or did it spread Arianism? Now, Campbell is adamantly opposed to Arianism. Adamantly. Okay? However, the creed that was against Arianism, that taught that the Son was of the same nature as the Father, that they both shared the divine essence, and they were co-equal and so forth, Arianism became popular, partially as a result of its rejection. So Campbell would say, putting those things in writings in the form of creeds, it makes heresies last longer than their day. And part of that seems to be true. Now, I might phrase it slightly different, but it can't be denied that because Arianism became debated and sort of politics and a lot of things were involved with it, it seems to be the case that Arianism for a while gained some popularity because of its rejection. At least that seems to be what's suggested. That's what Alexander Campbell has to say about this. So, and I'll share a quote on this in a moment, so hold on to that. After this, they both, like before, they both claimed victory. So, there you have it. All right, let me share this with you now. This is what Alexander Campbell has to say, and I picked out, I think this is the clearest on it. You can go in that document. This is from my printed version, so I've included the date on there so you can find it, because it's slightly different than my printed edition. It's not just that page number. But the point being, this is what he says. We do not say that creeds, and I am recording this letter for letter and comma by comma for how he has it, so English is a little bit different than we would use it today. We do not say that creeds and confessions of faith are the causes of all errors and heresies. So, he is not saying that creeds are evil. Okay? I've never so taught anywhere. And again, this is how he phrases it, so I know the grammar is weird. Our proposition does not say that there are the cause of all heresy, very different from it. I teach that parties are older than written creeds, and that there were persons who made divisions before they were written creeds. The Nicene document was the first document of any kind embalmed on the pages of history. Yet it had been so for the political, but had it not been for the political views and the inference of the great Constantine and his 318 bishops, Arianism would, like all previous feuds, had lived its day and died. So, he's actually saying that one of the ways that you can destroy heresy is not to just include another document in the book of documents that everyone has to agree on, but that when those pop up, refute them from the scriptures, let them have their day and die out. Because what you'll end up with is a much longer book, like the Westminster Confession of Faith, or like all of the creeds of the East and West, and you'll end up teaching things that might be addressing issues that are not present there, and you actually immortalize heresies inadvertently. Now, whether you agree with Campbell or not, I want you to see his heart behind this and his intentions, because this is what he and Rice actually disagreed on. They both placed a high emphasis on the scriptures. Okay, but what Campbell is saying is, those creeds that you are creating, it's not that they are the cause of great evil, but They don't destroy factions. They don't destroy parties of heresies. They inadvertently boost them on at times. Okay. And so much that he's saying. I'm summarizing this, but this, I think, is the most helpful understanding of creeds for him. Okay. Now, let me share with you someone from the 4th century, Gregory of Nazianzus. So he's living in the area of Cappadocia. He's sometimes, in recent years, been referred to as one of the Cappadocian fathers. He's by far one of the greatest minds the church has ever seen. And you can read his orations and see that clearly. Gregory of Nazianzus, he's reflecting because he was at the Council of 381, where they kind of reiterated Nicaea and expanded a little bit on the Holy Spirit and so forth. And in 381, after he's present for that, he doesn't remain, a bishop for much longer. And I want you to see why. This is what his reflection is on from the council. Okay, this is what he says. For my part, if I am to write the truth, my inclination is to avoid all assemblies of bishops, because I have never seen any council come to good end, nor turn out to be a solution of evils. On the contrary, it usually increases them. You always find there are the love of contention and love of power. I hope you will not think me a bore for writing like this, which beggar description. And while sitting in judgment on others, a man might well be convinced of ill-doing himself long before he should put down the ill-doings of his opponents. So I retired into myself, came to the conclusion that the only security for one's soul lies in keeping quiet. That's from Gregory of Nazianzus. If you had ever, him, Basil of Caesarea, Gregory of Nyssa, Athanasius, those 4 figures, how do I say this, were the reason why Nicaea, from a literary perspective, triumphed. They were contenders for the triune God in the 4th century. And after 381, after the council, he reflects on this and he says, man, the council didn't solve anything. So, historically speaking, I think it's fair to say Nicaea, Constantinople, go all through the early 7 ecumenical creed councils, and were they as successful as a kind of eradicating heresy as we sometimes portray them? And if not, how was Arianism really kind of done away with? Well, in some respects, it pops up again throughout history. So Jehovah's Witnesses today, for example. But in practice, heresy is not eradicated by the creation of creeds, but from the refutation of the scriptures. Okay? So I would go as far as to say, Campbell would likewise agree with Gregory that if you look at these 4th century councils, you're not going to see the solution from the council. You're going to see people come in and articulate, summarize what they've already been teaching elsewhere. And both of them, I think, have the same goal. This isn't to downplay the importance of creeds in some capacity, or even that they can be beautiful things or used in liturgy and worship. They're great. And Campbell studied the creeds. When he was spending an hour every morning in Latin, that's why he's able to cite the creeds so openly. Evidently he knew them and had prayed them. And many Restoration Movement preachers know them. And this is great. But the question we need to ask, really, is if the creeds do not eradicate heresy, or the councils, then why would we think that the use of them now would eradicate heresy? Okay, Now, it does provide, as I've mentioned before, and this I think to push a little bit us all, and this would be my question for Campbell, is could we use them to help us be in the borders and the guidelines in the path of correctness, and so the creeds help us from swaying too far from the right or left. Not that they are sufficient in pushing us forward, but they help protect us from heresy. And I think, in my judgment, that's how I would use them now. But the larger point, what I'm showing you now is, the stuff that Campbell's saying was also said by the greatest minds who attended these councils. Okay? All right. Moving on now. Walter Scott. And I just have a few things to say about him, because a lot of what he's doing is taking place during these debates, so it's relevant to bring it up now. You'll see this picture passed around a lot in the Restoration Movement. These are, the four great minds of the Restoration Movement. Walter Scott, then you've got Thomas Campbell, Alexander Campbell, and Barton Stone. So these are the four pioneers, and they would call it at sometimes the Reformation instead of the Restoration Movement. There was a lot of playing around with the names. It's not really relevant right now. So that's Walter Scott, the evangelist. If you miss everything else that I say today about Walter Scott, what I want you to hear is that he was not just a prolific author, but he was a wonderful preacher of the Scriptures. And it's in his ministry that the Restoration Movement really begins to take off. Okay. So just an overview of his life. He's coming from Scotland, from Edinburgh. I mean, he's very similar to the Campbells, Presbyterian background. But he joins in on this church of the Haldanes, or Haldanes. I've heard it pronounced both ways. The Haldanes were a similar group to the Restoration Movement, but they were mostly taking place in Scotland and Ireland, and they had established many churches. And there are a few years actually before the Restoration Movement really picks up. They're already preaching as early as 1807 baptism by immersion. It's a big one for them. Weekly communion, big one for them. And then they actually did practices like foot washings in services. And so they did a lot of other practices. But they also emphasized, and this is before he's really part of the Restoration Movement, he's a part of this group, they emphasized the role of the Scriptures in discerning doctrine. So, yeah, that's what he was a part of. And so it's kind of natural to flow into Campbell and be a part of the same movement. But one of the things you should notice from this is that it's not just the Campbells and Stone that are kind of advocating Christian union by the Scriptures. Similar movements in the same point in history and actually predating Campbell are taking place in Ireland and Scotland and Europe, and it seems to be in some missionary societies as well over in England. So that's just a small tidbit. But he eventually becomes a minister in 1820. I say he came to America in 1820. He actually came in 1818, so I don't know why I have 1820 there, but it's 1818 that he comes. Not that it matters at all, but that's why he's there. So that's wrong. And then he comes, he meets the Campbells in 1821. Evidently, he really picks it up with Alexander Campbell at this point. And some of the earliest publications of Walter Scott are in the Christian Baptist. So, evidently Campbell trusted what he had to say even before they were really working together closely. But they became close friends as a result of that. This eventually leads to some of the most successful years of Walter Scott's life. He's chosen in 1827 to evangelize in Ohio. It's sometimes called the Western Plains, but it was actually the northeastern part of Ohio. There's reasons for that, but it's in the northeastern part of Ohio, kind of off-road bits of land. And he converts thousands. I mean, in these 3 years, he converts 3,000. For perspective, the Baptist Association, and your book mentions this a little bit, the Baptist Association was kind of keeping track of members, and they were, from one year to another, before Walter Scott, they hadn't grown much in terms of people who were members of their church. By the time Walter Scott goes out and comes back, so in 1828, the movement had doubled in size. I mean, so Walter Scott kind of takes a lot of these ideas, and one of the beautiful things that he does, and this is why I appreciate Walter Scott's writing so well, is Campbell and both Thomas and Alexander were really prolific and brilliant men. Sometimes they lacked the ability, dare I say, to simplify it so that everyone could understand what they were talking about, which is a great skill. I mean, if you're going to preach, you've got to be able to communicate things in a way that's understandable. And while Campbell was brilliant in debates and prolific in Latin and Greek and all of the other languages that he knew, sometimes he wasn't able to communicate clearly. Walter Scott, on the other hand, he had taught Greek and Latin. He's a smart guy as well, and his works influenced many people after the 1830s. But it was more found in his preaching that he was able to walk people through the scriptures in an understandable way and convert so many people to the faith. So really brilliant preacher. So he's really only part of this, the Mahoney Baptist Association from 1827. This is who chooses him, and until 1830. And then the Mahoney Baptist Association dissolves, but he keeps on preaching anyway. And he moves back and forth from Cincinnati to Kentucky and elsewhere. He gets married, he has kids, but it's in these couple years that he really has his most prolific preaching life. After 1832, at this point, when you have kids, you slow down on some stuff. If you have kids, you know what that's like. But in 1832, he started spending most of his time writing. So he is the first president of one of the Christian colleges, and he slows down after that and turns it over and keeps on writing, keeps on publishing. But his influence, even though he preaches, his influence shifts to more writing. But it's this expansion, this rapid expansion, that really changes things. So in 1832, that's the same year that Stone and Campbell kind of joined together, and or officially the two movements become one. But at that point, it's hard to say, but the numbers are that Alexander Campbell's kind of churches, and he would detest me saying it that way, but they were anywhere from 12 to 20,000 people, and Barton Stone's was about 15,000 people. And the reason why Campbell's side was so large was because of Walter Scott, because he was such a brilliant, simple preacher. And he encouraged others who weren't so successful all the time. He called them faithful as well. All right. One thing to share with him, and then call it quits here. So he kind of invented this idea of the 5-finger exercise. When I say he's a simple preacher, I don't mean to say that he couldn't walk through the scriptures. What I mean to say is that he taught children before he taught their parents. Very fascinating idea. He would pull up into a town, and he would bring the kids over, and he would have them hold up their fingers, and the 5 kind of parts of the faith, of understanding what Christianity is. It's you have faith, you start believing that what the preacher is saying is true, you repent, you are baptized, you therefore receive the remission of sins, and then you get the gift of the Holy Spirit and are becoming sanctified and grow, and you have that seal of salvation of what is to come. And so he would teach this to children, and then he would have them go tell their parents. And in practice, what happened was the parents would show up to this revival, and knowing that their kids knew this really simple thing, he would show up to the revival, and parents would have their scriptures there ready to kind of disprove Walter Scott. And no, he walked people through it and showed them especially at this point what became a very prolific verse in the Restoration movement, Acts 2:38. Repent and be baptized in the name of Jesus Christ for, or gar, into the remission of sins, and you will receive the gift of the Holy Spirit. So that simple exercise was remarkably successful, and it showed that the Restoration movement wasn't just a movement that was purely an intellectual force, but children could understand the type of thing that this movement was teaching. And yeah, that's what begins to happen. So there's a lot of heavy topics there. Next week, we'll spend the whole week looking at baptism, in particular because of a correspondence that I'm having you read from between Alexander Campbell and someone else over the centralization of baptism. And Campbell will say that there are Christians in other denominations, and that it's not for him to decide who's saved and who's not. And you see, I think, next week some of the most beautiful parts of Campbell, and also really just the callback to Scripture. Now, these people were not intending to go out and attack people for not understanding the Scriptures, but in kind of bringing them in the same way we see in Acts, and teaching them the way of Jesus more fully. So that's what we'll look at next week. We'll look mostly at the Scriptures of baptism, and there's plenty to cover there. But all of the debates that I have on there, don't feel like you need to read those. You couldn't anyway, and there's a couple thousand pages of them. But if you want to get a taste about what some of those looked like, you're free to do so. All right. God bless you all, and I'll see you all next week.